about something that Jake brought to me a while ago, which was a YouTube video talking about slop, or I believe it was in that video that he brought up explicitly Netflix's principle of second screen content. And it was after watching those videos, thinking about the fact that there are companies out there that are not just trying to, that aren't even really considering making something the best that it can be, just making something that is essentially tolerable enough to not put people off. That I had the idea of planned obsolescence of media. And what I mean here is that my background is I'm a mechanical engineer by trade, and a growing frustration with the modern world mechanically is that if you have your great great grandmother's toaster, that thing very well may still be working. But if you go out and buy a toaster from wherever, even if it's a nice one, it's probably dead within 5 years. And Apple explicitly really brought the idea of planned obsolescence into a pain point for a lot of people by making their phones intentionally run slower after a certain period of time. And the principle here is that consumers, it's much more profitable to drive your consumers into new products continuously rather than try to create the best product, period. And I have a theory, maybe this is giving people too much credit, but that some of the big wigs at some of these different media companies, whether it be Netflix or Disney or, Amazon, they're not, when we criticize them for making, objectively bad media, or we, as a lot of folks on the right love to talk about, inject woke ideas and things like that, that we're kind of missing what the top level is seeing. And that is that all of this media will be completely irrelevant within just a few more years. And there will be a hunger for an entire new wave of media. First of all, I'm curious, do you really think that there's not an interest in creating good art anymore, good media of any kind within the corporate world?
I think part of it, well, also just to kind of let people know, the exact video for those who want to take a look at it, we'll leave it in the show notes below, is Slop Economics by Pillar of Garbage. And specifically, one of the films he highlights in it is called Damsel, which is a vehicle for Millie Bobby Brown from, I believe, Stranger Things. And that became Netflix's most popular film, but also kind of a testament to the second screen model where it's essentially something left on in the background. I do think there's still an interest in creating good art, even in the upper echelons of a lot of these various industries, because you do find, whether in recording or in streaming or in blockbuster filmmaking, you do still see quality work being put in on a technical level. You're still seeing, quality work being put in through music scoring and so on. And at the same time, also the idea of kind of planned obsolescence, while not necessarily as nefarious as what it kind of sometimes feels like nowadays, does have precedent, does have a history. They essentially were the B movies, the films that were meant to fill out a double bill, the films made for lower budgets, the films that were kind of meant to be thrown out into the world and then forgotten just as soon as you threw them out there. And I mean, that goes back to the Golden Age system, back in the 40s and 50s. That goes back to the idea of Poverty Row filmmaking, companies like Monogram that were just cranking out cheapies like they were going out of style. But at the same time, what made that kind of instance special is the chance to rise through the ranks, the chance to actually go from working a B unit to working an A unit. A great example of this actually was Val Lewton over at RKO, who horror fans and fans of Golden Age cinema will know as the producer behind a lot of really, really stunning horror films like Cat People, I Walked with a Zombie, which, lurid titles as they may be, created an incredible artfulness, cinematography, beautiful scores by one of the house composers, Roy Webb, and an incredible knack for spine-tingling visual storytelling. And some of the big directors that would come later on, like a Robert Wise, was actually working up to directing and started directing films like I believe he did Body Snatchers. Kind of kept moving on up the lines to doing even bigger films like, The Day the Earth Stood Still and so on. But that's kind of an example how, yes, these were meant to be disposable films, but at the same time, they proved to be training grounds. They proved to be places where people could ply their trade, cut their teeth, and then move up. And
Yeah.
similarly, you kind of see that in, when VHS, and, you had kind of, your home video format wars in the 80s and VHS won out, the direct-to-video market kind of became that, although it definitely sort of turned into its own MIDI ghetto as the years wore on, where people would then, actually recede from kind of that low-budget studio filmmaking back to doing the direct-to-video stuff and working at companies like a Full Moon. But at the
Hmm.
same time, that's still its own self-sustaining ecosystem and still, levels of quality there. But also the interesting case in both situations is that there was time for a reappraisal later on. You know, 70 years on, films, 70, 80 years on from films of the 40s, like a lot of these, B pictures, they became, not only is it just, horror fans dredging it up and you're having like Vinegar Syndrome releasing all these esoteric little micro budget flicks,
Yeah.
but these are films that have influenced, big filmmakers. I know, directors like Jacques Tourneur, who become, really lauded by lots of people, ranging from, I believe Scorsese's talked about him before, but you've also had writers like Harlan Ellison, going gaga.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that's strange about these, is that these are not micro budget features. These are like millions and millions being pumped into films that are just kind of meant to exist. I believe there's been
What's
other titles like
strange? What
go
I was
ahead, go
going to
ahead.
say is what's strange is as you were talking about this, it made me think about, and I don't feel like this is as common, but I remember noticing this numerous times whenever I was in high school in the early 2000s, and that is you would get a blockbuster movie, and I believe that there's a very particular term for this kind of movie, but you would essentially, there'd be a blockbuster movie coming out, action hit starring Tom Cruise, and it would be a sci-fi and everything else, and then to kind of release at the same time or right around the same time, there would be another movie. It would have another big name, maybe Matt Damon in space or whatever, but it would also be sci-fi. It would have a similar aesthetic to it, but they would put very little money on marketing it, and they would just kind of toss it out there. I'm trying to remember what that is, but the thing that it makes me think of is I feel like almost all movies that are not part of a franchise that's being exploited endlessly feel like that latter movie. Like I don't understand. I understand that they are still marketing movies now, but I don't feel like anything has any distinct parts anymore. And even if you go back to the like you're talking about the direct to video or these micro releases or direct to cable type things where you'd have something like the Sci-Fi Channel there for a little while. You would have these really good horror movies and things like that occasionally come out of that that mess, essentially.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I struggle with in terms of modern media is that I just don't. I'm always looking to rationalize how do we get here with the what would you say with like just sort of the soulless nature of it. It's very odd.
Well, I think part of it is to kind of jet back to the B movies of the golden age. The idea there, like I was mentioning, is the chance for upward mobility,
Hmm.
is the chance for being able to go from sound recording up to editing, up to camera, up to directing. And this was a model that guys like Roger Corman, the late great Roger Corman, who we lost last year, that was how he launched dozens, dozens of film careers. You would not have James Cameron without Roger Corman. You would not have Martin Scorsese without Roger Corman. You would not
Hmm.
have Francis Ford Coppola, who literally was doing sound recording on one film, was allowed to make, this cheapy little horror flick, Dementia 13, I think it was called on a bunch of odd jobs. And then slowly but surely, literally a short decade later, he's the man directing The Godfather. And even later down the road, he's directing Apocalypse Now. So it's like there's a utilitarian reason for that sort of disposable media. It is the way you kind of graduate from tier to tier up into the upper echelons of the industry. And I think that's the strange thing, is that it feels like this disposability has now creeped into the tens of hundreds of millions of dollars
Hmm.
that we're seeing on films that come and go in the cycle in like the blink of an eye. And part of it also is sort of a information age problem, where it's not necessarily just the fact that it sort of all falls back into the primordial soup of the release schedule, but also just the fact that information and trailer campaigns and release windows are happening at such a rapid click, however the proper term is,
Yeah.
that nothing has a chance to take hold. Obviously, even in the days before home media, it took a film, really clawing its way up to become this national, international sensation, goes off, cements its place in the American canon. Right now, it feels like the people interested seriously in film be people who want to, the international space, who explore, more art house or more independent, have been kind of ghettoed off from the mainstream populace. We used to have people who can make, we used to be a nation where we'd have guys like Igmar Bergman in from Sweden, or Kurosawa in from Japan, being like interviewed on like late night television, like being talked to by like Dick Cavett. And, there was an exposure of this kind of cinema to the masses. But then, kind of in the atomization of the internet age, if you want to be the art house international guy, you can go off here. If you just want to be the blockbuster IP forever guy, you can be over there.
Hmm.
And you get these situations where, it's kind of people who are actually talking about films and exploring films and sinking their teeth into them are almost in this completely different world from the mass market, and are also separately from the world of, the people who are doing the, bog standard culture war criticism, talking about Star Wars, talking about Cape films, talking about all that stuff. It's like people kind of being segmented off and being kind of split apart. So it's almost like Hollywood's kind of pitching these films towards like a central audience that either doesn't exist or simply is not responding in the way it traditionally has.
Well, I think one of the fundamental truths of the internet age is that eh, everybody, not everybody, but more people have something a little bit weird about them than the people who have nothing weird about them. And so, whereas in the past you had a common shared culture, and I know that like Razorfist has talked about this with music quite a bit. He harps on it frequently, but the idea that there is no pop music anymore, and that's why pop has kind of just stagnated into the exact same sound of what it has been for the past almost 30 years now. But when people are genuinely given options, they will choose a much wider variety of things than what than what you might have thought. And if there's no core viewer anymore, if the average viewer is actually a minority, or if the median viewer, shall we say, instead of representing something like 60% of the population only represents about 20% of the population, then that is a real problem if you don't have any kind of guiding vision for what you're doing. And I think that's why to pull it back to the planned obsolescence. I don't know if they're necessarily intentionally making stuff that is going to be dated. It becomes a lot easier to listen to those fringe whenever you're kind of looking for somebody to lead you. You know, it's if you're lost and nobody knows the way to go, but one person is shouting very confidently that they do, then I understand the impulse to at least give it a try. So I don't know. Also, I think that there's something to be said for the fact that there's just a lot of money, and the more churn of money there is between different organizations or anything. Anytime you have money trading hands, there's a perfectly legitimate amount that gets skimmed off for the people who are handling the money and who are, employing the people and doing X, Y, or Z. So you give something a big pile of cash, and the only way to increase your your income is essentially just keep going bigger and making more and going harder. It creates kind of a snowball effect where you just have to keep going in the direction that you're going. You just have to keep moving. You have to keep getting bigger, or else you might be hosed. And you got to keep the charade up.
Yeah, and that's not even just that's not even just necessarily kind of a Hollywood thing or even a record
Oh no,
studio
that's
thing
that's
because
universal. That's
oh
universal.
yeah, absolutely. But the other interesting thing too about those particular fields though is the nature of a lot of these um the way I've kind of described it is that sort of it's the last pillars of the mainstream. Like this is the decades old infrastructure. And
Yeah.
for better or worse, it's probably going to be there for a while simply because so many of these companies have diversified to such a point that it's not necessarily that they're too big to fail, but that it's not going to be this, magical, oh no, we took one, block out of the Jenga tower, the whole thing comes down. But
Hmm.
rather kind of, you look at what's happening with Warner Brothers Discovery, hemorrhaging money, making all these bizarre decisions, the tax write-offication of, if you want to talk about planned obsolescence of media, I mean, right there, that's probably the golden ticket item. Literally, films that are being, if not dumped onto streaming, like Clint, the man with no name Eastwood,
Hmm.
90 something years old, hitting a home run with his recent legal thriller, Juror Number Two, getting a paltry limited release and then being dumped onto Max. Or
Yeah.
on the flip side, Batgirl getting shelved, Coyote v Acme getting shelved. That right there is almost kind of the ultimate example, and probably the furthest extreme example you could give of that idea of kind of the planned obsolescence of media that's not even being given the chance
Yeah.
to go into a theatrical run. Um, and the other interesting thing too, to kind of jet back to the music part, is that music's in this very fascinating stage where, because of the atomization as an art form, I don't think it'll ever be in need of saving per se. Because even if you don't like what's kind of happened to, mainstream top 40 radio pop, what's happened to,
Yeah.
mainstream country radio, if you want to go down the rabbit hole of what Clear Channel did, in the playlistification of all these various stations. But, even with all that, there are still so many different directions to go out. You can catch up on artists who were even popular just 10 years ago. Like last year, I was not expecting to say, hey, last year, Foster the People released a freaking killer album. And then all of a sudden I'm bumping freaking Chasing Low Vibrations from their most recent release. And of course, I remember the song, but not the album title. And it's a great fucking track. And I'm like, why isn't this catching a lot of airplay? Why isn't this on, anyone's top 10 list and stuff like that? But that's sort of the atomization in effect. Music, there's such a variety of genres and such a variety of styles, and we now have access to music from literally across the globe. There's the reason why things like, the idea of like city pop started really coming up to the fore, or even in the mainstream, the kind of the importing of K-pop, groups like BTS and so on, where it's like we now have access to to more music than ever before. And it becomes a sort of a choice paralysis problem, where if you don't know what you like and you curate for yourself, you're just going to sit there listening to whatever the Spotify radio station starts playing for you, or you're just going to turn on the radio and let that happen.
Yeah, and I
So
think
it's
well,
oh, go
I was
ahead.
going to say to rewind also slightly. You were talking about the idea that these various media empires won't just Jenga block collapse one day. I think that's very true, and I think one of the things to kind of reel it way back to talking about the indie world is that I think one of the first hard lessons that indies have to learn is that just because a consumer is dissatisfied with their current media offerings, it does not mean that they're going to actually replace those media offerings. And this is kind of where I think there is some credence also to the planned obsolescence angle, which is that I genuinely think that there are a number of consumers that are out there who don't necessarily differentiate between something like sci-fi and Star Wars. As far as they're concerned, these two words are, or these two terms are interchangeable in their mind. So if they want if they didn't like the last sci-fi franchise, meaning Star Wars, then the next Star Wars franchise, they're still going to give it a try, no matter how many, well, maybe not no matter how many times it's bad, but they're not going to go out and start looking for new sci-fi because it won't be Star Wars. And to them, that's as different between going back to toasters. That's just not a toaster anymore if it's not Star Wars. And so I think that these big cultural institutions that have scooped up these IPs, and I think movies represent the ultimate in terms of expense and complexity, and really the most amount of time time and money to get one all the way across the finish line in a competent, professional manner. That we're gonna be dealing with this, I think, for quite some time. It just I don't know where it ends and when the consumer finally starts to pick things up and try new stuff. I think that the consumer alternates between, like you said, choice paralysis, where they have too many options, and sort of a mind, like just a complete disengaged feeding tube, sort of setting. So that's sort of,
Yeah.
I feel like the two settings for the for the modern consumer, unfortunately.
Yeah, I probably agree with that too, because the way I also look at it is, like I said, these are kind of the last. This is kind of the old infrastructure, and it's very rare to see a proper collapse of things. I mean, a good example is actually in comics, with the distributor Diamond going under. That's
Hmm.
now actually cut off a pipeline for indies to get onto brick and mortar store shelves, which, while people say, oh, but everyone buys online, people still go into stores. People still visit, their Barnes and Nobles. They still visit their mom and pop bookshops. It's still, important to have a physical item out there in the real world. And so you kind of get examples of that. But on like that macro scale, it's sort of, because they have basically all the old infrastructure, and a lot of people are comfortable with the old infrastructure. It's the reason why, even though people are keep cutting the cable, you know, we haven't seen all of satellite television,
Hmm.
evaporate. We haven't seen, Spectrum's cable division completely implode. People still watch bog standard network television. It's just true. People still engage with all these old pipelines. I mean, there's no greater example of this than probably the country music market, just because that is so radio driven that you're like legions across rural America always, they have their station, they have their favorite station. I think in upstate New York, of what from where I originally hail, I believe there was a station, Bug Country, based out of the Utica area, I think, and that was kind of our local chapter of that. And that kind
Hmm.
of goes back to sort of like the pipeline system of, major record labels getting artists on, recording their little, you know, uh, snipes for, I'm blank and you're listening to and stuff like that. So it's like this stuff is still all there, and because of the convenience, the sheer convenience, it's just easier for people to go with it rather than put in the effort of curating for themselves and going against it. And not that, people don't, and not that people shouldn't, but just that there is people, and this is the thing that kills me a little inside, to say, as an artist, as someone who takes this seriously, not just as a, producer thinking about the business, the marketing side of it, but also as someone who does think about it regularly as an artist. It kills me to say this. At the end of the day, we're not the most important thing in the world. And there's a level of perspective you really need to have to recognize that. We're talking about incredible truths, we're talking about enriching people's lives, but there is that sad, just, and it's not even like a, oh no, we're all doomed. It's not like that. It's, you simply gotta sit down and realize that you are not the most important thing going on in their lives right now. You bring them joy, you bring them happiness, you bring them a little enrichment, you bring them ideas they may not have considered. There are bills to pay, there's work to be done, there's families to take care of. You can attest to this. You're a
Yeah.
father. And it's like, as much as we all love these things, and as much as I, even, still working my way up from it, even though I'm not, making my Brewster's billions and I haven't been scooped up by, Universal BMG or whatever. Um, even if I have the luxury of being able to immerse myself in media and studying and working on it and creating it, one, not everyone has that, even as a creator, because a lot of people are hobbyists, but also you do have to step back and realize, I love what I'm doing here, but I'm also not the most important thing in the world. There's like a huge ego death you really got to have
Yeah,
to
I think that's very
get to
true.
make it in this.
Well, and also just to kind of, yeah, explain the normies slightly, and that is that all decisions take some amount of effort. And one thing that I've kind of emphasized to people is that just because you're making a better product than whatever is being offered in the mainstream, that doesn't mean that it's not. I mean, by definition, it's going to be a different product. And so, if people are used to, like, I'm going to keep harping on the sci-fi and Star Wars. If the consumer is only familiar with Star Wars, that's, to them, these things are interchangeable. Like Star or sci-fi is either Star Wars or Star Trek. That's the two options. And you start putting out some different ideas. Let's say that you are talking about Ringworld or whatever, and you're going back to these classics that were in many ways inspirational to a lot of the later sci-fi that they've probably seen in terms of media that's filtered its way into those two franchises. Even it doesn't mean that they're not going to take longer to maybe digest it, and just the act of having to sort of expend that additional effort thinking about it can sometimes be uh, something that people have to learn it's kind of a learned taste to a certain degree, you know. This is why I think, and I know I'll probably upset some people with this, but this is why I think Warhammer 40K is so popular. It steals tons and tons of IP ideas from everybody all the time. And I don't necessarily mind that. I wish that Games Workshop was not so litigious about it, stealing something and then accusing people of stealing that I actually invented this.
Sort of pulling the Harmony Gold Robotech nonsense.
Yeah, doing the meme where it's like I made this, you made this, I made this. Um, but they're literally out there suing Starship Troopers for you know existing
Good
when
freaking
they
grief.
took the whole Space Marine idea, right? And but to get back on point, Warhammer 40K I think is so popular in part because it provides a framework that people can already learn and understand, and they can just sort of relax even more. They can disengage their brain a little bit and then they can think about some other piece. But because that piece is being brought in through the Warhammer 40K universe, it's more digestible to them, or at least they feel like it is.
Right.
And so that's one of the real strengths of established IPs. It is it's not even that they're better or anything else, but indies need to realize that the consumer is just more comfortable with them, and as a result, you have to be just that much better whenever you're engaging in these things. And not only are you maybe not the most important thing in the world, but you have to take the attitude of that it's not about you, and that can not just be a humbling factor, but also a way to draw some inspiration in the sense that if somebody didn't like something, if you're not finding traction, it's you don't have to crash from being the best person ever. You're going to save the entire genre with your wonderful ideas, with your wonderful novel or comic or game or movie or whatever. To oh my god, I've been rejected, I'm the worst thing ever. It's no, you just the market wasn't ready. You can don't cope with that too much, but that can also be partially true. Is that you just didn't quite have the right framing. You had some good ideas, you had some great stuff, and with time and development, maybe you can get there. But there's sometimes when you're maybe just trying to stack too many things in all at once, and the consumer is just not ready. And later on, after that same reader or viewer will come back and look at it after they've sort of developed their taste more, or they're more familiar with some of the ideas, and go, oh, you know what, this actually is really good. So just to kind of mix in a little bit of encouragement with the reality check there.
And that's also goes back to what I was saying about the sort of rediscovery of the work of a Val Luton, or the rediscovery of, like in Italy, which kind of becomes patron saint of, making mockbusters and ripoffs and things like that.
Yeah.
um Films that are being treated as these semi-disposable, from thrillers like the Giallo, black gloved murder mysteries with a heaping dollop of blood here and a little TNA there,
Mhm.
to the spaghetti westerns, to the sword and sandal wave that came in the wake of a lot of big biblical epics that were being shot in Rome in the 50s, your Ben Hurs and so on.
Mhm.
Even then, you have people that'll come back and retrospectively be like, oh my God, this is fantastic. Or, oh my God, there's a lot of real artistry happening here. And you
Yeah.
get these incredibly influential names coming out of this soup, like a workman kind of director like Lucio Fulci, who becomes kind of this, not just this patron saint of, some of the gorier films of the 80s, but who kind of shows himself to have this incredible lyrical, this incredible sense of style, this unique sort of surrealism about his work. Or you have, oh my God, a poor guy like Jean Rollin, who was a French filmmaker and was making these incredibly beautiful, incredibly poetic, and incredibly moody little horror films, but he was keep getting, screwed over by everything from distributors to producers to circumstance. And yet he's kind of this deeply cherished name in a lot of cult horror spheres. So there's always room for rediscovery. There will always be people who will come back one day and say, by God, that was something special. And the other
Hmm.
thing too, because I have the unique perspective of kind of being in both the complete workman, I'm just here to get the job done, but also having my own personal project with something like a 365 infantry.
Hmm.
My firm belief is it's best to have two projects. It's best to have your sandbox, and it's best to have your workhorse. Sandbox is you just doing whatever the hell you want. And it's kind of why, and I'll say this, and it's gonna sound like a backhanded compliment, but it really isn't. 40K is a bit like smashing your action figures together, but you remember the feeling of how much fucking fun that is when you're a kid. That's what kind
Yeah.
of makes it so much fun, is the bizarre crossovers and the way things intersect. And it's what makes, I think that's part of its enduring appeal, is that through this crucible of various influences, you do come up with something original, not necessarily in when you break down the totality of its parts, but when you look at the sum of them. And that's
Hmm.
kind of what I've treated 365 infantry as. Like, I've always given my core influences as, it's like the action and automotive thing of Mad Max with the cyberpunk style and atmosphere of a Blade Runner, and the sheer gonzo variety of heavy metal, both the wonderful fucking film from 1981 and also the magazine, which is actually coming back recently, which is going to be kind of exciting to see how they've retooled it.
Yeah, I'm very
Um,
curious.
so you have kind of those core influences, but from there, I have written everything from some pretty wholesome slice of life stuff to some really dark horror, like really stern stuff when I go back and read it, to just, action comedy, drama, romance. It is basically my own personal playground. And the great thing about having a project like that is that you can do whatever you want. You could put all of your personal fascinations and fixations into it. And then when you go to the workhorse, you can say, that's the market I want to hit. Time to hit it. I want to
Yeah.
start writing sword and sorcery. Read my Liber, read my Howard,
Hmm.
jot down a couple of 3,000 word stories, start flinging them at magazines. Boom, boom, boom. If none of them sell, you edit them, you put them together in a book, you put it up on Amazon. Easy money.
Yes.
And so it's like, that's
Yes.
kind of the beauty of it, is that there is no, there obviously there's the marketing, and obviously there is finding your audience. It's kind of the blessing and curse of atomization, is if you're trying to solve the how do we glue back the monoculture problem, you're gonna find yourself kind of disappointed horribly. But if
Yeah.
you focus, if you kind of take advantage of the fact that there is an audience for everything, then you will find it. You couldn't have told me, 3, 4 years ago when I started developing 365, that there was going to be anyone who wanted to read this bizarre pulp throwback speculative fiction thing starring these wolves with the denim and the leather and all this, and the hot rods and the motors. It's like, you couldn't have paid me to realize there would be people reading it, and yet there is. It's
Yeah.
a small but mighty readership, but it's there.
Yeah.
And all you got to do is stick in it, just stay in the game, which is unfortunately how a lot of people do miss out when when the wave finally hits,
Hmm.
is you didn't hang in long enough. And so you kind of miss your time to shine. But basically you just stay in the game and you just keep focusing on making it better and better and better, and then reaching out to however many people are actually interested, and doing whatever it takes. Some cases it might be a bit of a almost like a guerrilla social media strategy. But in other cases, it's just as simple as, hey guys, this is my newsletter. I'm going to share it in these, Discord servers, or I'm going to go on these forums. Hey, if you like this, keep reading it. Let me know what we're doing here, and just growing out from there.
Yeah.
Steady releases, staying in the game, and staying kind of focused. Because the
Yeah,
other
not
issue
not
with the
quitting is
atomization,
probably the biggest
yeah,
factor in all of
and it
this,
and it's
because
and it's also
it's
the
much
big.
more difficult. I will say the indie world in general is so much more uh, difficult to make it long term than I think anybody realizes from the outside.
It really is. It's kind of, I sort of joke about kind of running around with the fake cigar in my mouth, like, welcome to the New York rat race, kids.
Yeah,
But it's like that's really what it feels like, genuinely. And it's very easy. In fact, it's too easy to quit these days, more than ever,
hmm,
because of the fact that, you know, many people's social media strategies are hinged on kind of these, and I'm going to straight up call them archaic, because it's like we've said almost everything we could about, what went wrong with X, Y, or Z project. And yet it's the same every time a new Star Wars streaming series is released. It's the same soft shoe dance. It's the same, oh, they did this with the women's, and they did it, they
yeah,
did this, that, and the other thing. And it's like, buddy, I heard you when we were screaming about The Last Jedi.
yeah.
It's been a decade, sweetheart.
Well,
It's
speaking,
it's the current year plus 10. This should terrify us all.
yeah, speaking of current year plus 10, I wanted to also bring up one of the other things that I think is going to be kind of a recurring topic with this, which is the sort of meeting of like both of us are on the right politically, but I think both of us have been very frustrated with the attitude, not only the attitude of the right towards culture, but just the misunderstanding of, I would say, creating art while being
Yeah.
political versus creating political art. I feel like that there's a real thought process within some extremely politically minded people who, the ones who are extremely, who are purely politically minded, they think to themselves, well, we just need to talk about 1984 a bit more, or we just need to have a right wing version of Star Wars, or whatever else. We keep harping on Star Wars, but it's an excellent example. Whereas I think some of the more culture war, and that term itself has become a bit of a meme, but
Yeah.
the more culturally engaged people who were also on the right politically have found themselves in a state where, yeah, they keep talking about these same failures within very similar, I mean, basically similar failures and similar projects, and it's very similar stories going on for the past 10 years. But at the same time, I have some empathy towards them, because, like, with the way that consumers are, it seems to be what they want to hear about. It's much easier to find an audience rehashing these issues than it is to find an audience that's interested in moving on. I believe that audience is growing, but there is a real difficult line to walk as somebody who is on the right politically, and wanting to create things, because there is a sort of, Jake, would you agree with this, that there's a wisdom, or a tribal wisdom, that people seem to claim that, oh, well, you need to make your work a little bit political, you need to have some head nods and everything else, so that you can get that boycott, if you will, where you get a bunch of right wingers, um, you know, uh, jumping on a project if it's more political. Have you heard that kind of idea?
I have heard that before, and I have heard I can't even remember who it was, but apparently Anvil wasn't enough, our guys TM enough, and
Yeah.
that's why the guy stopped reading it or whatever. I can't even
Oh, that
remember that.
one. Yes, I remember that review now.
Yeah, no, and
Yeah.
it's just it's and here's also the thing, and this is where I have to, and it's good we're dispelling this episode one. I would say I'm kind of center right on most things, but my one, my
You're
deep
also
my
very young, everybody. Just so you know,
yeah.
Jake is still in his early 20s. He still has plenty
Yes,
of time
I'm
to come to
still
his senses.
clinging to the one liberal belief I will cling to, you'll have to, in the words of Charlton Heston, pry it from my cold dead hands, is my belief in being able to get along with people and being able to not make a meal out of every single thing, because there's something about holding your fire, as opposed to, just spraying the Mac 10 everywhere and going ballistic. It's that I have, I'm friends with people across, all sides of the spectrum, different beliefs, different whatevers. You can, if you want to go down the identitarian route, you can go down the identitarian route. I can say, yep, friend here, friend there, friend there. If we want to just talk, the political binary, yep, that's where I keep the communists. That's where I keep the third positioners. That's
Yeah.
where I keep the sane people. A lot of sane people, fortunately. So it's like, I'm a terrible ideologue. I'm an absolutely god awful ideologue. So just to get that out into the air, which makes what I say, I focus on this purely in the business terms, and the kind of unfortunate issue the right finds itself on the topic of culture, where it's like everyone wants the parallel economy, but they seem to like talking about it more and building the parallel economy around talking about it more than, the fruits of it.
Than
Then,
actually using the
hey,
parallel economy. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
There's,
exactly. Is actually
I won't throw stones in the first episode, but there's a, moderately well known parallel economy website where it's like, oh, well, we can do this. And I looked into it, I started asking him, I was like, okay, but how do you drive customers? Oh, well, your listing, we can get you listed on our site, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, okay, but like how many page views, like are people actually coming here? And they literally like, oh, we don't necessarily think you're a good fit, and just terminated the conversation. The right wingers, I'm not
Jesus
even joking.
Christ.
The right wingers who are like, I'm going to build the parallel economy. Okay, cool. Okay, well, let's say that you have a fencing business or whatever, and like they'll approach you no matter what business you are if they figure out that you're right wing and say, we'll get you on your website so you can connect with other right wingers. Okay, cool. But how do you get other like consumers to your website? Oh, didn't this thought has not entered our mind, because we're making our money by charging you a couple bucks a month to have your listing on our website. You know, it's there's a
Basically
lot
every
of really bad faith actors, unfortunately,
and every
in this
and
space.
everyone and the worst part is when everyone likes being in their ghetto. That's the other thing. People get nice and comfy in their ghetto, which kind of not only just stagnates thought, because I will say that I do think thought has stagnated around the culture conversation. You'll have people that try to break through, and they're always they're also the people that are making the most fascinating work, in my opinion. Like a great example is a sculptor, Fen de Villiers, who does these beautiful modernist sculptures with this very striking sense of angularity and a very expressionist kind of zeal to them.
Hmm.
I think he did a piece called Momentum that just struck me in such a way. I wrote out like a small, like a minute of just this battery of percussion, just because that's what it sounded like to me. It's almost a bit of like a synesthesia kind of moment where you see the work and then this cacophony of sound hits you and you just got to get it down however you can. Um, and he's talked about stuff like kind of a literal art house, an actual collaborative, collective kind of place.
Hmm.
because there is such a thing as too cool for schooling yourself out of not even necessarily just
Oh,
a movement,
100%.
out of relevancy, out of being able to
Yes.
actually make a difference. And that's kind of one of the things, that's the other reason why I kind of made 365 my sandbox, is that I will go on record saying that yes, there are themes about the nature of, the nature of freedom, the nature of liberty, the nature of, obviously, the central focus of the series is this war between these kind of outcasts in the desert and this sentient, artificially intelligent computer network running the last city in the known world. And essentially, there's this, obviously there are themes of what's happening right now with, when narrow AI becomes, I believe it's general AI is the next
Yeah.
stage
Yeah.
up. Kind of that, oh God, when's the super intelligence coming? When's Skynet coming? It's like
Yeah.
there are all those kind of fun conversation to have there, topically. But I have written this series in such a way that you cannot pigeonhole it. Like if I wanted to, line go down right now, but it's like I could probably make a case saying the way I code characters, the way I write these relationships, the way I present the world, I could probably go on record saying it's probably the most diverse thing you'll ever read in your life. And the best part is I don't cram it down your throat. It's not the point of it. It just came naturally out of the confluence of genres and ideas and interests. And that's kind of the big thing. There's such a lack of intuitive thinking in the creative process when it is conceiving some of these works, when it is promoting some of these works, when it is trying to cultivate a ecosystem that can flourish on this. It's
Hmm.
always bam, 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 hit them over the head, hit them over the head, hit them over the head with the
Well,
idea.
I also think you mentioned something in passing that I think is important, and that is the idea of an art house and whatnot. And I think that one of the major problems that we suffer from, we meaning broadly anybody who is not a committed sort of left wing ideologue within the creative space, is that if there's there is a real problem with having a not an area or a institution, any institution that is not explicitly right wing eventually becomes left wing, is the saying. I forget who said it, but I believe that is mostly true. It's certainly true today. And so I think a lot of these subgroups, because a lot of these communities don't just pop out of the ether. They develop as the result of either collaboration or small fan groups, or just one creator getting, whether it's his friends or his fans or whatever, together. That there seems to only be two paths right now, and it's because almost everything is occurring online, and the path is you either go mainstream, quote unquote, which will ultimately be driven further and further leftward until you hit a point where you don't want to engage in that way any further, and you say, all right, listen, because one of the critical flaws of the modern political left is that there is always another demand, essentially. And what you see most commonly on the right, and the right should be, I think, should think longer and harder about this, is that a lot of the new converts and new allies that they have aren't there necessarily because of their own any change in their thinking. It's because their thinking did not change, and they simply got ejected from the left. And
Yeah, and it's not even just, and the worst part too is that you can see where overextension gets you, and it gets you
yeah,
what happened in November.
yes, exactly. But to bring it back to the culture side of things, then you have the right wing where they're like, okay, well, we are going to gatekeep and filter people out of our communities, and so you have these dueling problems. And really, what I think the root cause is that there needs to be more in-person human interaction to a certain degree, especially for creatives. I'm an engineer, so I'm not as inclined towards dealing with people as the average creative. But I see that there is, a need to be able to express ideas, especially ideas that might not be that would not be viewed kindly by the broader public, either for right wing reasons or left wing reasons or whatever reason. Sometimes during the creative process, you have an idea and you're like, I just sort of want to see where this goes. And if you are doing anything online nowadays, it's very seldom that you're doing it one on one, just because of the nature of even if it's in DMs or whatever, there's now the real potential for everything to be broadcast to the entire world. Whereas if you're actually physically in a location having a discussion, about a character, let's say that you're like, this character is, I'm thinking about where I want to take this character, and they have had a really traumatic experience. Maybe you're thinking about doing some awful thing. Everybody always mistreats their protagonists, right? That's part of one of the rules of good storytelling. Well, how badly you mistreat them can really put people off in some cases. And if you like kind of bandy about some of these ideas and tinker them around with people in person, there's a lot more trust. There's a much greater understanding, I think, of, well, I'm just sort of trying this idea out. And there's none of this, the world is watching or the world could be watching sentiments that are running through either party's mind. And I think that is one of the problems with, and I was initially thinking this as an issue with the right, but I think it's also an issue just across the board, left, right, or center, that creativity has gotten a lot more constrained with the advent of social media and the way that things have changed. Just because, you've lost sort of that spare piece of paper to doodle on and really show people, what about this? And sometimes, like you said, with that sandbox idea, it's good to just have a place where you can tinker about with ideas. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're committing to these ideas in a full-throated endorsement or that you expect them to sail. But when you start closing off these various places that you can try stuff, I think it ultimately becomes restrictive, and you lose a lot of the people who I would say were most concerned with just trying to create art, and you end up bringing in, just through not bringing in, but the people who last are the ones who are more concerned with a business or political mindset, and that's I would say unfortunate. That's a detriment both to the left and to the right.
And not even just that. I think also going back to my own point about kind of intuition over this blunt force messaging,
Yes.
is that if we wanted to put it in the, the culture war terms, it's not only the right completely ceding to the left's, proposition that, all art is innately political, you can't escape it, but also accepting the misreading, in my opinion, of what's truly happening, which is that you can't escape what your subconscious is trying to say. There is always subtextual meaning when writing a work. It is
Mhm.
inescapable. However, the key thing is that it doesn't have to be so god awfully executed as
Mhm.
we've seen in recent years. I mean, I've gotten to see from a very peculiar vantage point, teenager growing into young adulthood, of seeing things get almost morbidly worse in the mainstream, but also in the art house. I think that because it's become sort of the sole domain of, further fringes of the left, that kind of art cinema and certain corners of international cinema have kind of stagnated intellectually. There's
Hmm.
only these kinds of things, these sorts of views you can express. And I think it's not necessarily just a, I think it's more or less just an echo chamber thing. It's not even a we're thinking about this thing. It's just this is our status quo. This is how we operate on, and it's in this completely different world from the fucking rest of us, which in some respects I think is what makes, if it's done well and it's done smart and it's done with intuition, where it's not here, pummeling you over and over and over. I'm sure that's
Yeah.
going to sound fucking indecent in the edit, but who cares?
Yeah.
we're here to entertain as well as inform. Put up the little, IE graphic on everyone's
Yeah.
PBS station. But seriously, it's like the best of this kind of work is done intuitively, is done where it's not slamming you over the head, or if it is being forthright, like like an Eisenstein Battleship Potemkin, it is done with incredible craft. Like you cannot watch the Odessa step sequence from Battleship Potemkin and just not be struck by the suspense, by the brutality in his use of montage. And it's
Hmm.
like that is one of the key things. You can learn from these elements and then take those techniques and put them in service to your own ideas. But the key is approaching it from a sort of a freedom that ideological focuses do not permit. If I am obsessed with making quote unquote right wing art, my brain's going to explode again before I get even like 5 words down on the page, because I'm sitting here fretting about, is this going to read like I'm too much of a centrist, or is this going to read like, too, totally tubular reactionary or whatever? Like, there's a million, freaking demons that'll visit you in the night over it.
Yeah.
But
Well, I
what
think
makes
also there's some creatives who are inherently very political in their thinking. And so I don't necessarily want to condemn that. But what I will say is I think we were talking about seeding frame. Like the right is unfortunately seeding a lot of ideas to the left culturally. But one of the strengths that I think is most missed, and this is kind of what you're I feel like getting at to a certain degree, is that the left in large part has seeded the idea of beauty and aesthetics as being right wing. And I think the right wing really, if you're political, if you're a primarily political thinker and you're also very creative or you're wanting to do something, I think that in a lot of ways, if you just like sprinkle your message, but then focus on leaning into making high quality, beautiful work, whether it be, I mean, the easiest example of this is characters, right? The mainstream left seems to have just a real hatred for beauty on average, and if you can lean towards this and focus on just making quality work, it will almost inevitably end up, by their reading of it, be quote unquote right wing coded. And I think that there's not enough creators that realize that it's not like basically give the reader, give the consumer a bit more breathing room to let those ideas actually enter at the subconscious level rather than try to, you know, break down the front door, so to speak.
Well, yeah, and the other thing too that makes it interesting is that it's those ideas of like beauty are still present in certain wings of international cinema and in the art house. Like there are frames you'll see, of course, this is also my $1 million problem, is that I don't watch enough contemporary film to pull this up. There's actually no, there's a great example of this. It was a film out of Nigeria. I'm closing my eyes and recalling from the depths of the Library of Alexandria here.
Yeah.
Um, from I think 2021 or 22. No, I actually think it might have been 23. Called Mamiwata. and it was shot, I swear to God, like something Elia Kazan would have done in the 50s. Beautiful high contrast, brilliant use of shadow, wonderful sense of light. And I still need to sit down and watch the damn thing, but I remember those shots, the painterliness of it. And it just you don't see that kind of talent generally speaking. That's the other key thing. A lot of people use ideology to supplement talent.
Yeah, to be
There's a
frank,
lot
that is very true.
there's people make too much of a meal out of, where are the right-wing artists and shit like that, where it's like they're there and there's plenty of them. But there is still a threshold that people do refuse to cross, which is allowing the message to come about naturally, organically, to come through the work. If a message even comes, because that's the other thing too. Sometimes the keys to it is to not even have a message at all, is to go in, there are characters, there's a conflict, the conflict's resolved, the journey along the way presents these fascinating ideas and images, and then leave it to the reader to kind of make of it what they will. And it's something that actually has, been fascinatingly revealed by the work of a man like, because as many might know, midway through January, we lost one of the great All-American originals, David Lynch, and
Mhm.
this fascinating experience happened where people from across all sides of the political spectrum, the furthest fringes of the left, the furthest fringes of the right, everyone in between, just it just kind of stopped and was like, my God, he's gone. And there's this incredible outpouring of love for not just, the man himself, who was by all accounts seemingly a wonderful human being, a great friend, just a great guy to be around, and a great director too, by that virtue, but someone who completely surrendered himself to intuition, who surrendered himself to the idea as kind of like the building block of everything. And he refused to ever say this definitively is what this film is about. He always gave people the freedom to explore, to interpret his work, everything from, the bizarreness of Eraserhead, the poignancy of An Elephant Man, the and kind of the steady style he cultivated from, I'd say, Blue Velvet to Mulholland Drive, just this incredible range of, emotions, of visuals, of sound, of the flow between images, the flow of images and sound. And people interpreted it in so many different ways. And one of the key things about his work that made it resonate in such a way is it was all done with utmost sincerity. That's kind of the big deciding factor in what made Lynch kind of, I believe it was Pauline Kael who described him as a populist surrealist. And that's kind of what made him work in that sense. He
Mhm.
was a man who just as easily will show you these lovingly created images of classic Americana. Everyone thinks about the opening to Blue Velvet, the white picket fences, the red roses, Bobby Vinton's song over top of it, the fireman driving down the street in the big beautiful machine. And just as easily it'll turn to the bugs crawling and scrambling beneath the grass, and you'll have all these moments of poignancy and sincere concern, and just as easily see some of the most mentally queasy things. You'll just makes you turn in on yourself, just be like, ugh. And he does it all in such a perfect free flowing manner that people
Mhm.
will make of it whatever they wish. And I think that level, and obviously I'm not expecting everyone to be, hey, let's all be David Lynch. But what I am saying is that to have that level of security in your intuition, a lot of people just don't have it. And that's why they often turn to, okay, let's say this is my theme. These are my, characters. And they try to do it
Well,
surface level. And because they want to, well, just finish
yeah,
the
go ahead.
point, because in the ideological context, that's where the problems begin, where it's like, I have this message I want to send, and I'm going to make it so there's no misinterpretation. We're not going to have a Starship Troopers discourse about it. But they often lack the ability to massage it, to work it into the work. And that's where you get these, god awful pieces, left, right, whatever, that beat you over the head with the message. I think that's the critical drinker joke, is the message. And it happens just as easily on the right. I mean, you see it with sort of that wave of contemporary Christian cinema in the 2010s, like a God's Not Dead or a Do You Believe, which almost act as an opposite number in that kind of banality, and that sort of, this is all we're trying to say this thing, and we're going to make it so it's so unmistakably clear, and it insults the intelligence of anyone watching, reading, or listening to it.
Yeah. Well, and I think one thing about that before I kind of go in a slightly different direction, and that is that I think that one of the traps that shows itself to creators who are either directed in that fashion or are inclined towards that is that there is a audience for people who just want something that they know that they for sure agree with. So that audience does exist, but I think that it is once again, it's a highly niche audience, and I think that it is an audience that is not necessarily going to ever produce things. They're not going to move stuff out of their niche into the mainstream. Not that that's the goal of every artist, is to get into the mainstream, but like once you target that audience, I think you have essentially cut yourself off from the other vast majority of consumers.
Absolutely. And the other thing too, just to kind of put my finer point on that, is just, if the goal is to change hearts and minds, if the goal is to sway people, and we're not trying to do this in a debate bro setting. This isn't blood sports. This isn't about, here are my studies to back up my philosophy.
Or
it's
the
like
10-second dunk. Yeah.
Exactly. Or it's the, L plus ratio line of thinking people have on, microbloggers, X, whatever. If you're just focused on preaching to the choir, yeah, you make people feel good for 90 minutes, but it's a small amount of people compared to a larger amount of people that could do with the good news, as it were. And that's kind of where it's not just a limiting market, it's kind of completely counterintuitive. It goes back to the idea of not only going into your ghetto, but getting comfortable in your ghetto. It's the idea of completely severing yourself from the potential of growing and exposing people to greater ideas. Like I said, I sort of in my in my teens, as if they're half a century ago.
Let's not delve too deeply into that timeline there, but continue.
Right, exactly. But I essentially I was probably leaning more towards being an atheist in high school than anything. But at the same time, I watched a film like Ben-Hur, like the 1959 version, Charlton Heston, directed by William Wyler, Miklos Rozsa's gorgeous score right to the final hallelujah finale. And I was moved. At a time when I wouldn't consider myself, Christian or anything, I was sincerely, emotionally stirred by that film. And it's like, I can't think of a single thing that's come out of, say, the contemporary Christian market that can have that sort of power. And not because, they had all these big, beautiful matte paintings, A.R. Gillespie playing with all his toy boats in the MGM backlot. Oh, it's a big, big, beautiful film, big, big stars, big, big sets, the big chariot race. The emotional core of that story, the themes of brotherly bonds severed, the themes of the redemption, the kind of the way, the almost kind of web of influence Christ has throughout the course of the picture, even though he is never seen on screen until the wide shot of the crucifixion towards the end. And of
Yeah.
course, the incredible storm and the eclipse and all of that. And yet it's like, I'm saying, like, that's almost, you almost feel that way.
Yeah.
Because of the emotions of it, and because of, you see kind of the effects, you see sort of that version of the gospel, and it resonates so much more strongly than, poverty porn. Oh, won't the Lord save us? And things get worse and worse and worse, and you just got to keep having faith. And then all of a sudden, the Hallmark movie has the happy ending. It's like diametric opposites. One is made as comfort food to reassure those who are already in the fold. The other has the power to pull people in. And there's such a lack of realization of that if I'm looking at this from a pure business, like, this is your goal, this is what you want to achieve, I would go for more Ben-Hurs than whatever the heck, the Kendrick brothers are cooking up this week.
Yeah.
I would.
Whenever you are creating that, focusing on the end product, trying to communicate these things and developing that intuition, like you were talking about. This goes back to what I was saying, where people essentially, and I related this to having in-person interactions, but I think the fundamental issue is that people are not allowed to make mistakes, generally speaking. And they're not allowed
100%.
to do anything that's outside of this or that. Everybody really wants to pigeonhole you and classify you as quickly as possible so they can either dismiss you or embrace you. And if...
Buddy, that's the reason why this generation, my generation, Gen Z, is terrified to do fucking anything.
Well,
it is that fear. It is that, not only just that fear of being pigeonholed, is the fear of rejection, the fear of failure, the fear of not only just making mistakes, but in some cases, people are made to feel like that one mistake is the worst possible thing to ever happen in the history of ever. Like, people have there's very little mercy, I feel, especially online. It's harder to do this in person. It's harder to be a prick in person. Many people are good at that. They're damn good at that. But, as trite as it may say, it is easier to hide behind the keyboard and the screen. And I hate to say it like that, but there's a truth to it, and it's inescapable.
Well, I also think the impact of it is lessened somewhat. So it's sort of like you punch a little bit harder if you're wearing boxing gloves, right? You know what I mean? Like,
right.
If you're bare knuckle, there's going to be more damage on both ends. But back to the idea of developing intuition and working these ideas in, I think that the best thing that we can do as creatives and as consumers also within the indie space, in this kind of, obviously I love the Iron Age term, but within the non-woke and the sort of outside the mainstream cultural space right now, is be more understanding and a little bit more forgiving of these things. And I think that creatives are inevitably going to make some mistakes, and I think that if they aren't making at least some mistakes, then they are likely stagnating into something. You're seeing essentially as good as they're going to produce. And frankly, within the indie sphere, almost all of us need to get better and keep driving that, driving the quality levels higher and higher. And if we can allow ourselves and the people around us to do that, I'm not necessarily calling for, a total abandonment of all principles and that we embrace everybody with open arms no matter what their behavior is, but to make room, like you were saying, for mercy and for forgiveness, to have some Christian principles here as well, allow people to essentially repent if they did something, and thinking a thought, God might consider a thought as good as the sin, but we're not God. So, cool it. Just because somebody
Yeah,
has a thought
literally.
that you don't, just because somebody in a creative way might be tinkering with something that you find that, like, okay, that's some commie BS. We're not going to be doing that. What are you thinking? Then, don't cut their head off because of that. Have a little bit of grace, and let God judge on some of this. So I think that's a big message.